There's a sense in which you can only be tempted by good things, right? And here, these are all good things. Tempted by bread to feed his hunger, tempted by the prospect of his being revealed as the Son of God, and tempted by the prospect that all things be revealed as being under and subordinate to him. And the question I have is, it seems to me that his replies in every case, you might say, enact the posture that affirms the deeper good that he would be denying by giving in to the temptation. So but he literally says, man does not live not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeded of the mouth of God. By saying that, he's actually, you might say, living on the spiritual sustenance of that higher relationship spiritually.
Well, that's what he says at the end.
Well, yes,
right?
and so too with over the other two, you might say they enact the very thing that is the antidote to the temptation. But it's also very interesting that in every case, he says, it is written. So he's quoting scripture. It's not, in some sense, they are his words as the Son of God. But in another sense, he's not taking upon himself even to answer out of his own words. And I'm wondering what others make of this. Why is it
here? He does call himself the embodiment of the prophets and the law, right? He's there to fulfill the prophets and the law, not to replace them. And so I think that's a callback to that. It's a very interesting point, because your question is, why does he take 3 opportunities to call back to Scripture per se?
Yes.
Right? When he could, in principle, say something dramatic and original.
Only answering in the language of Scripture.
Right, right. Well, and further on your point, we'll just finish this. Christ says to Satan, "Get thee behind me, for it is written," and this is the antithesis, "Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shall you serve." And so he's stating that heart and soul have to be oriented towards what's highest, and that's the antithesis to the power drive, which I believe to be the case. And that also seems to fit in very nicely with the sacrificial motif. It's, if you're in the proper relationship with your children, even your disciplinary strategies are done not as a consequence of power, but in service to what's higher, which would be the furtherance of their spiritual and physical development, right, in a spirit of love, right?
Well, it's in service of parental authority, not power.
Right.
And we have confused power and authority, so we have totally destroyed authority.
Yeah, but even parental authority is not
Teachers don't
arbitrary.
have authority, parents don't have authority, police don't have authority, so the state ends up having all authority.
If we conflate authority and power, that inevitably is the case, right? And I think there's a truly dark motivation underneath that, which is the best way to undermine legitimate authority is to make the case that there's no authority but power, right? Because then there's nothing, instantly there's nothing legitimate. That's sort of the core of the war on merit, as far as I'm concerned.
I think the answer to your question also is back to the opening of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It was written, it has been said. It's all conflated.
Well, I think picking up on that, Stephen, the way I'd answer you is, I think something is very powerfully being modeled there. Like I say, I see Jesus using the sacred text to move to a more encompassing perspective that makes him more oriented to what is more real. And that is something we can emulate. We can do the same thing. We're locked in this situation. We can step outside of our egocentric autobiographical thing, go to the sacred text, look at our situation from that perspective, and be called to something beyond ourselves. I think Jesus is actually modeling a way in which human beings can self-transcend via, not self-transcend in an ego sense, but the way I mean, right, through a sacred text. I think he's modeling something for us.
When my wife was dying, that's what she decided to do. Instead of calling on God to rescue her from her predicament, being thrown off a high mountain, you might say, she decided that she was going to try to conduct herself as perfectly as possible while moving through that trial, right? And so she decided, this is what Job decides in the story of Job. It's exactly the same thing, is that even under the most dire conditions, you have the option of maintaining your upward aim. And the promise is that if you maintain that upward aim, the best possible outcome will occur. Now, that might not be what you want, but like you said, what the hell do you know? You know, we saw in Exodus what happened to the Israelites when they got a surfeit of what they wanted, right? Quails out their noses. It's like the pornography conundrum. You get too much of what you want, you're going to be one unhappy.
It is, in fact, I think actually the case that I mean, all of these are good things. There'd be a million reasons Jesus could give to actually do exactly the things that Satan is tempting to do. And certainly speaking for myself, I mean, when you're tempted by something, you can think of all kinds of reasons. That good thing that you're being tempted by is exactly the thing you should do. And I think there's something very powerful
That's the voice of Legion, by the way, behind the sin.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's something revealed here about the fact that Jesus doesn't use, in that sense, his own words. And I wonder if that is the case with us when faced with temptation, that the mark of being able to resist it truly is that the words with which you do it are in some profound sense not your own.
Yeah, this is empirically verified. Sorry, this is experimental. That's an experimental question. Sorry. And I do work on that, and there's experimental evidence to exactly this. If you're in a situation and you, even this, here's a tough problem you're wrestling with, you can't solve it. Redescribe it from a third-person perspective, and you'll have an insight into your problem. Right? This is the Solomon effect.
That takes you outside yourself.
Right? If you can just get outside the automatic supersalience of your egocentrism, and you can go through a perspective that you don't claim ownership on, that has a terrific capacity to free you from the imprisonment. And this is experimental. I mean, in the sense that we have run well-designed experiments on this to show this in multiple different
John,
contexts.
you see that echoed in the psychometric literature. Self-consciousness loads on neuroticism, right? This is a fundamental thing to understand, is that there is literally no difference between thinking about yourself and being miserable. They're statistically inseparable. And so, and then the upshot of that would be, well, you don't just not think of yourself. That's not the cure. The cure is to think of something that's beyond yourself. And then you might think, well, if you're in really fundamental trouble, you might need to think of something that's like a long ways beyond yourself. Ultimately,
eyewitness testimony too for trauma victims sometimes is describe it like it happened to somebody else. Come out of yourself and describe it. I have one last thing on the temptations off what both of you said. You talked about how Jesus breaks the frame. And it's so interesting because that's, one of the masters of that, perhaps the greatest in modern days, was Christopher Hitchens. When somebody would come at him with a question, he would disassemble the question. And so much of what we see is this rigid back and forth, right? Like, who do you think won the debate? And then one pundit says one thing and the other pundit says another, and we all know what it is. And it's a march through this. Each one of the answers that Christ gives to Satan re-breaks everything and is a transformative action on the frame that he's being asked. He refuses to engage with the supposition. And so that's also fractal.
He does that constantly, too.
Everything
as the
he does is
Gospels progress.
transformational,
Right.
even in the way you remarked and observed.